Chapter 1 of the Cheerful Smugglers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Cheerful Smugglers by Ellis Parker Butler. Chapter 1. The Fenelby Tariff. Bobberts was the baby, and ever since Bobberts was born, and that was 9 months next Wednesday, and just look what a big fat boy he is now, his parents had been putting all their pennies into a little pottery pig, so that when Bobberts reached the proper age he could go to college. The money in the little pig bank was officially known as Bobberts' Education Fund. And next to Bobberts himself was the thing in the house most talked about. It was, "Tom, dear, have you put your pennies in the bank this evening?" Or, "I say, Laura, how about Bobberts' pennies today? Are you holding out on him?" And then, when they came to count the contents of the bank, there were only $23.38 in it after 9 months of faithful penny contributions. That was how Fenelby, who had a great mind for such things, came to think of the Fenelby tariff. It was evident that the penny system could not be counted on to pile up a sum large enough to see Bobberts through Yale, and leave a margin big enough for him to live on while he was getting firmly established in his profession, whatever that profession might be. What was needed in the Fenelby family was a system that would save money for Bobberts gently and easily, and that would not be easy to forget, nor be too palpable a strain on the Fenelby income. Something that would make them save in spite of themselves. Not a direct tax, but what you might call an indirect tax. And right there was where and how the idea came to Fenelby. "That's the idea," he said to Mrs. Fenelby. "That is the very thing we want, an indirect tax, just as this nation pays its taxes, and the tariff is the very thing. It's as simple as ABC. The nation charges a duty on everything that comes into the country. We will charge a duty on everything that comes into the house, and the money goes into Bobberts' Education Fund. We won't miss the money that way. That's the beauty of an indirect tax. You don't know you are paying it. The government collects a little on one thing that is imported, and then a little on another, and no one cares, because the amount is so small on each thing. And yet look at the total, hundreds of millions of dollars." "Goodness!" exclaimed Mrs. Fenelby. "Can we save that much for Bobberts? Of course, not hundreds of millions, but if we could save even $100,000 "Laura," said Mr. Fenelby, "I don't believe you understand what I mean. If you would pay a little closer attention when I am explaining things, you would understand better. A tariff doesn't make money out of nothing. How could we save $100,000 out of my salary when the whole salary is only $2,500 a year, and we spend every cent of it?" "But, Tom, dear," said Mrs. Fenelby, "how can I help spending it? You know I am just as economical as I can be. You said yourself that we couldn't live on a cent less than we are spending. You know I would be only too glad to save if I could, and I didn't get that new dress until you just begged and begged me to get it, and—" "I know," said Mr. Fenelby kindly. "I think you do wonders with that $2,500. I don't see how you do it. I couldn't. And that is just why I say we ought to have a domestic tariff. I don't see how we can ever save enough to send Bobberts to college unless we have some system. We spend every cent of my $2,500 every year, and we could never in the world take $250 out of it at one time and put it in the bank for Bobberts. Could we?" We never have $250 at one time. And yet $250 is only 10% of my yearly salary. But if I buy a cigar for 10 cents, it would be no hardship for me to put a cent in the bank for Bobberts, would it? Not a bit. And if you buy an ice cream soda, it would not cramp our finances to put a cent in the bank for each soda, would it? And yet a cent is 10% of a dime. "That is very simple and very easy," said Mrs. Fenelby, "and I think it would be a very good plan. I think we ought to begin at once." "So do I," said Mr. Fenelby. "But we don't want to begin a thing like this and then let it slip from our minds after a day or two. If the government did that, the nation's revenue would all fade away. We ought to go at it in a businesslike way, just as the United States would do it. We ought to write it down and then live up to it. Now, I'll write it down." Mr. Fenelby went to his desk and took a seat before it. He opened the desk and pulled from beneath the pile of loose papers and tissue patterns with which it was littered, the large blank book in which Mrs. Fenelby, in one of her spurts of economical system, had once begun a record of household expenditures, a bothersome business that lasted until she had to foot up the first week's figures, and then stopped. There were plenty of blank leaves in the book. Mr. Fenelby dipped his pen in the ink. Mrs. Fenelby took up her sewing and began to stitch a seam. Bobberts lay asleep on the lounge at the other side of the room. Mr. Fenelby was not over 30. His chubby, smiling face radiated enthusiasm, and if he was not very tall, he had a noble forehead that rounded up to meet the baldness that began so far back that his hat showed a little half moon of baldness at the back. He looked cheerfully at the world through rather strong spectacles, and everyone said how much he looked like Bobberts. Mrs. Fenelby was younger, but she took a much more matter-of-fact view of life and things, and Mr. Fenelby never ceased congratulating himself on having married her. "My wife, Laura," he would say to his friends, "has great executive ability. She is a wonder. I let her attend to the little details." The truth was that she managed him, and managed the house, and managed all their affairs. She took to the management naturally, and Mr. Fenelby did not know that he was being managed. They were very happy. Mr. Fenelby turned toward his wife suddenly, still holding his pen in his hand. He had not written a word, but his face glowed. "I tell you, Laura," he exclaimed, "this is the best idea we have had since we were married. It is a big idea. What we ought to do, what we will do, is to have a family congress and adopt this tariff in the right way, and write it down. That is what we will do. And then, any time we want to change the tariff, we will have a session of the family congress and vote on it." "That will be nice, Tom," said Mrs. Fenelby, biting off her thread, but not looking up. Mr. Fenelby turned back to his blank book. He dipped his pen in the ink again, and hesitated. "How would it do," he asked, turning to Laura again, "to call it the United States of Fenelby, or the Commonwealth of Fenelby?" "No," he exclaimed, "I'll tell you what we will call it. We will call it the Commonwealth of Bobberts, for that is what it is. The domestic tariff of the Commonwealth of Bobberts." "Yes," said Mrs. Fenelby, holding up her sewing and looking at it with her head tilted to one side. "That will be nice." Mr. Fenelby wrote it in his blank book at the top of the first blank page. "Fine," said Mr. Fenelby, growing more enthusiastic as the idea expanded in his mind. "And the Congress will be composed of everyone in the family. No taxation without representation, you know. That is the American way of doing things. Everything that comes into the house has to pay a duty. So everyone in the family has a vote, and every so often the Congress will meet in the parlor here." "Does Bobberts have a vote?" asked Mrs. Fenelby. "Ah, well, Bobberts is hardly old enough, you know," said Mr. Fenelby hesitatingly. "We will No," he said with a sudden inspiration, "Bobberts will not have a vote. Bobberts will be a territory. That is it. Grown-ups will be states, and infants will be territories. Bobberts can't vote, but he can attend the meetings of Congress, and he can have a voice in the debates. He can oppose any measure with his voice." "I should think he could," said Mrs. Fenelby. Mr. Fenelby turned to his desk and wrote in the book a brief outline of the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Bobberts. Mrs. Fenelby creased a tuck into the little dress she was making. She did it by pinning one end of the sheer linen to her knee and then running her thumb up and down the folded tuck. Suddenly the door opened, and Bridget entered with aggressive quietness. She was a plain-faced Irish woman, and the way she wore her hair, straight down from her brow, had in itself an air of constant readiness to do battle for her rights. When she was noisy, her noise was a challenge, and when she was quiet, her quietness was full of mute assertiveness. It was as if, when she wished to enter a room quietly, she was not content to enter it quietly and be satisfied with that, but first prepared for it by draping herself in strings of cowbells and sleigh bells, and then entered on tiptoe with painful care. "Mrs. Fenelby, ma'am," said Bridget, in a loud whisper, "would you be having the milkman leave 1 or 2 quarts of milk in the morning?" "Why, Bridget," said Mrs. Fenelby, "haven't I told you we always want 2 quarts?" "Yes, ma'am," said Bridget. "And you can't say that you haven't got them every morning either. If you can and wish to say it, ma'am, you may as well say it now as another time. I may have my faults, ma'am." "You have always attended to the milkman just as I wished," said Mrs. Fenelby, cheerfully. "Exactly as I wanted you to," she added, for Bridget still waited. "And we will continue to get 2 quarts a day." "Very well, ma'am," whispered Bridget. "I was just thinking maybe you had changed your mind about how much to get. It's all the same with me, Mrs. Fenelby, ma'am, about how much you get. I am not one of them that don't allow the lady of the house to change her mind if she wants to. I take no offence if she changes her mind. I am used to sich goings on, ma'am, and I know my place, and I don't wish to dictate. 1 quart or 2 quarts or 3 quarts is all the same to me." "Bridget," said Mrs. Fenelby, laying down her sewing, "do we need 3 quarts of milk?" "No, ma'am," said Bridget. "Well," asked Mrs. Fenelby, "are 2 quarts too much?" "No, ma'am," said Bridget. "But if you wanted to change your mind—" "Not at all," said Mrs. Fenelby kindly, but firmly. "Good night, Bridget." Bridget backed out of the door, and Mr. Fenelby, who had kept his head close to his book, turned to his wife with a frown on his brow. "What is it, dear?" asked Mrs. Fenelby, after a fleeting glance at his face. "Laura," he said, "what shall we do with Bridget?" Mrs. Fenelby looked up quickly. She quite forgot her sewing. "Do with Bridget?" she asked. "What do you mean, Tom? Has Bridget said anything about leaving? And I was only this afternoon congratulating myself on how good she was. I declare I don't know what this world is going to do for servants. We pay Bridget more than any one in this town. I know we do, and treat her like one of the family, almost. And now she is going to leave. It's discouraging. When did she tell you she was going to leave?" "Leave!" exclaimed Mr. Fenelby. "I never thought of such a thing. I was only wondering what to do with her in the Commonwealth of Bobberts."
"Oh!" cried Mrs. Fenelby, with a sigh of profound relief.
She took up her sewing again and bent her head over it. "Is that all? Of course Bridget expects to be treated like one of the family. I told her when she came that I always treated my maids as part of the family." "But we can't have Bridget come in and sit with us whenever we have a session of Congress," said Mr. Fenelby. "Certainly not," said Mrs. Fenelby, very decidedly. "I wouldn't think of such a thing." "So she can't be a state," said Mr. Fenelby. "And if we made her a territory, it would be as bad. She could come in and talk. She would insist on talking." "And if we did not let her," said Mrs. Fenelby, "she would leave, and I know we could never get another girl as good as Bridget." "Now you get some idea of the hard work our forefathers had when they made the United States," said Mr. Fenelby, rising and walking up and down the room. "But of course they had no case like Bridget. Bridget is more like the Philippines. Well," he exclaimed, "it is a wonder I didn't think of that in the first place." "What, dear?" asked his wife. "That Bridget is a colony," said Mr. Fenelby. "That is just what she is. She is a foreign possession, controlled by the nation, but having no voice in its affairs. She can pay taxes, but she can't vote." He hurriedly wrote the final words of the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Bobberts in his book, and drew a line underneath it, for Bobberts was showing signs of awakening. Under the line Mr. Fenelby wrote, "First Session of Congress." Bobberts awoke in a good humor, ready for his evening meal, and Mrs. Fenelby put aside her sewing and took him. "I am glad Bobberts is awake," said Mr. Fenelby, "because now we can go ahead and vote on the tariff. I wouldn't like to do it if he was not present, because he has a right to take part in the debate, and it would not be fair to hold the first session without a full representation. Now, suppose we make the duty on all goods and things brought into the house an even 10%. "That would be nice," said Mrs. Fenelby, absently, for she was busy with Bobberts. "How much is 10% of $2,500, Tom?" "$250," said Mr. Fenelby, "and that is what we ought to save for Bobberts every year. 10% will just do it." He had his pen ready to write it in the book, when a new difficulty came to mind. "Laura," he exclaimed, "10% will not do it. What about the rent? We spend $50 a month for rent, and that is nothing we can bring into the house. And theater tickets, when you go to town and buy them there and use them before you come home, and my lunches, and my club dues, and your pew rent, and ice cream sodas, and all that sort of thing. We couldn't collect a cent of duty on any of those things because we don't bring them into the house. 10% is not enough. We ought to make it at least—" He figured roughly on a sheet of paper, while the other state and the territory attended strictly to their occupation of feeding the territory. "I should say, roughly speaking," said Mr. Fenelby, "that to raise $250 a year, we ought to make the duty 16 3/4 per cent. But I don't think that is advisable. It would be too hard to figure. I might be able to do it, Laura. But if you bought a waist for $1.98 and had to figure 16 3/4 per cent. on it, I don't believe you could do it." "The idea!" said Mrs. Fenelby. "I would never think of buying a waist for $1.98. I try to be economical, Tom, but you know you always like me to look well, and those cheap waists do not look well, and they are really dearer in the long run, because they get out of shape in a few days and never wear well anyway. The very cheapest waist I have bought for years was that one I got for $3.47, and I could have done much better if I had bought the goods and made it up myself." Yes," said Mr. Fenelby, hesitatingly. "I am afraid you did not just catch my meaning, Laura. It does not make any difference whether the waste costs $1.98 or $12.63. I mean that it would be a hard job to figure 16¾ of it. Suppose we leave the duty at 10% on necessities and make it 30% on luxuries. That ought to make it come out about $250 a year. And if it does not, we can have a meeting of Congress any time and raise the duty." "That would be very nice," said Mrs. Fenelby. So it was decided that the tariff duty on necessities was to be 10%, and that on luxuries it should be 30%. And Mr. Fenelby wrote down in the book these facts, and the Fenelby tariff was in effect. End of chapter 1. Recording by Arnold Banner, Thurmond, North Carolina. Chapter 2 of the Cheerful Smugglers by Ellis, Parker, Butler. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2: The Box of Bonbons. The financial arrangements of the Fenelbys were extremely simple. Every week Mr. Fenelby received his salary and brought every cent of it home to Laura. Out of this she handed him back a sum that was unvaryingly the same, and with this Mr. Fenelby paid his car fares, bought his evening papers, his cigars, and such other little things as a man finds necessary. It was a very small sum, and Mr. Fenelby could not have afforded the pleasures of a club, nor many other things he did afford, had he not been able to add to his purse by writing occasional bits of fiction and jokes for the lighter magazines. Some months this additional money amounted to quite a sum, and when it more than paid his expenses, he would make Laura a little present. But it was understood that this money was his, and that it was something quite outside the regular income of the family, and not to be counted on for household expenses. The result was that sometimes Mr. Fenelby had quite a sum in his pockets, and sometimes he had hard work to make his car fare money last through the week. But one thing he never neglected was to bring home to his wife a box of bonbons every Saturday evening, and one of the things that Mrs. Fenelby flaunted before her female friends was the fact that, although she had been married for 5 years, Tom never missed the box of candy. This was the visible sign that his love had not declined, and that he still had a lover's thoughtfulness. On the Friday after the Fenelby tariff had been adopted, Mr. Fenelby came home with a box of cigars under his arm. It was his usual box of 25, and the usual brand, for which he paid 10 cents each, and after he had kissed Laura he gaily deposited 25 cents in Bobbert's bank. This was the first money he had put in the bank under the new tariff laws, and he took an especial pleasure in depositing it. Mrs. Fenelby had put many pennies and nickels in the bank during the week, because she had had to buy a number of things from the vegetable man and others. "How much did you put in, dear?" asked Mrs. Fenelby, as she heard the coin rattle down among its fellows. "A quarter," said Mr. Fenelby gaily. "I tell you, Laura, that boy will soon have a lot of money if it keeps coming in at that rate. A quarter here and a quarter there. It is amazing how it mounts up." "Yes," she answered, "but shouldn't you put in 75 cents, Tom? Cigars are a luxury, aren't they? And you know you said luxuries were 30%. Mr. Fenelby turned quickly. "Nonsense," he said. "Any man will tell you that cigars are an absolute necessity. Just as much so as food or drink or clothing. Every one knows that, Laura." "Why, Tom," said Mrs. Fenelby, "you told me only last night, when I merely hinted that you were smoking too much, that you could quit any minute you chose, and that it had no hold on you whatever. You said that you only smoked a little for the pleasure it gave you, and that there was no danger at all of its ever becoming a necessity to you. Of course, I don't care, for myself, what you put in the bank, but I should not think you would want to rob poor little Bobberts of what he really should have, just because you can twist out of it by claiming—" There were signs of tears, and Mr. Fenelby cheerfully stepped up and dropped 50 cents more into the bank. It was one of his periods of plenty, and he would have been willing to put dollars into the bank instead of quarters, rather than have Laura think he was trying to defraud Bobberts. He explained to Laura that all he wanted to know was what he really ought to pay, and then he would pay it cheerfully. Probably all men are like that. They only want to have their taxes assessed fairly, and they will pay them joyfully. One of the prettiest sights imaginable is to see the taxpayers gleefully crowding to pay their taxes. I say imaginable, because it is one of the sights that has to be imagined. The next evening was warm, and Bobberts was sleeping nicely, so Mrs. Fenelby walked part of the way to the station to meet Tom when he came home, and her eyes brightened when she saw the square parcel that she knew to be the box of candy in his hand. He kissed her right there on the street, as suburban husbands are not ashamed to do, and put the box of candy in her hand. "And what do you think my news is?" he asked, after he had asked about Bobberts. "Brother Bill is coming to make us that visit that he has been promising for ever so long." "Tom!" cried Laura. "And what do you think my news is? Kitty is coming to spend 2 weeks with us. Isn't that the jolliest thing you ever heard of? Both coming at the same time. I wonder if they—" "Well," said Tom, who generally had a pretty clear idea of what Laura meant to say next, "if they did fall in love with each other, it would not be such a bad match. Your cousin Kitty is as nice as any girl I know, and I rather think Billy isn't such a bad sort. Anyway, they will make it pleasant for each other." "It will brighten us up all around to have them here," said Mrs. Fenelby. "I wonder whether we ought to make them pay the tariff on things. That was the first thing I thought of when I read that Kitty meant to visit us. It does seem a little like inhospitality to make them pay tariff." "Not a bit," said Tom. "They will like it. It will be a lot of fun for them, and you know it will, Laura. Would we like to be left out of anything of that kind if we were visiting any one? Of course not. I don't know Kitty as well as you do, but speaking for Billy, I can say that he would be mighty hurt if we did not treat him just as we treat the rest of the family. He will think it is a jolly game." "I am not afraid of how Kitty will take it when I tell her it is all for the benefit of Bobberts. She will be wild about the tariff. The only thing I am afraid of is that she will go and buy things she doesn't need or want, just in order that she can put money in Bobberts' bank," said Mrs. Fenelby. "I told Bridget about the tariff to day, and she was so interested. Every one I tell about it thinks it is a splendid idea, and wonders how you could think of it." "I do think of some things that other people do not think of," said Mr. Fenelby, rather proudly. "But that is because I accustom myself to use my brains." "But it is surprising how a little thing like this tariff counts up," said Mrs. Fenelby. "My bills this week were $14, and I had to put $1.40 into Bobberts' bank, and then I had to pay Bridget's month's wages to day, but I didn't have to pay any tariff on that, and I had to pay the gas bill too, but I didn't have to pay any tariff on that, thank goodness." "Of course you have to pay tariff on the gas bill!" exclaimed Mr. Fenelby. "The gas came into the house, didn't it?" "But you said I didn't have to pay tariff on the rent bill," argued Laura, "and the rent bill is just as much a bill as the gas bill is. You know very well, Tom, that we always figure on those 3 things as if they were just alike, the rent and the gas and Bridget, and I don't see why, if there is a tariff on gas, Why, there should not be one on rent." "Rent isn't a thing that comes into the house," explained Mr. Fenelby. "You can't see rent." "You can't see gas," said Mrs. Fenelby. "You can see it if it's lighted," said Mr. Fenelby, "and you can smell it any time you want to. Gas is a real object or thing, and we buy it, and it pays a duty." "Very well," said Mrs. Fenelby. "Then I ought to pay duty on Bridget, too. She is a real thing, and we pay money for her just as much as we do for gas. And she is a thing that comes into the house. If I don't pay on Bridget, I don't see why I should pay on the gas. The next thing you will be saying that Bridget is a luxury, and that I ought to pay 30% on her. Probably I ought to pay a duty on Bobberts. I don't think it is fair that I should pay on everything. I will not pay 10% on the gas bill. Everything seems to come the same day." "Laura," exclaimed Mr. Fenelby, with sudden joy, "you don't have to pay on the gas bill this month. I wonder I hadn't thought of it. That gas bill is for gas used before the tariff was adopted. And now that you know about it, you will expect to pay next month." "I shall warn Bridget again about using so much in the range," said Laura. "We shall have to economize very carefully, Tom. I can see that the tariff is going to make our living very expensive." They had reached the house, and had lingered a minute on the porch, and now they went inside, for they heard the dinner bell tinkle. "You had better drop 8 cents in the bank before you forget it," said Mrs. Fenelby. "8 cents?" inquired Tom, quite at a loss to remember what he was to pay 8 cents for. 8 cents," repeated his wife, "for the candy. It is 80 cents a pound, isn't it? But it is a luxury, isn't it? That would be 24 cents." "Yes, 24 cents," said Tom, smiling. 24 cents. But I don't pay it. You pay it." "I pay it?" cried Mrs. Fenelby. "The idea! I didn't buy the candy. I didn't even ask you to buy it, Tom, although I am very glad to have it, and you are a dear to bring it to me. But you are the one to pay for it. You bought it." "My dear," said Mr. Fenelby, "whoever brings a thing into the house pays the duty on it. I gave you the box of candy when we were a full block from the house, and you accepted it. And it was your property after that, and you brought it into the house, and you must pay the duty on it." For a moment Mrs. Fenelby was inclined to be hurt, and then she laughed. "What is it?" her husband asked, as he seated himself at his end of the table and unfolded his napkin. "I'll pay the 24 cents, but please don't bring me any more candy," she said. "I can't afford presents. But that wasn't what I was laughing about. I just happened to think of Will and Kitty. Will they have to pay duty on their trunks and all the things they have in them? Kitty has the most luxurious dresses, and luxuries pay 30%. If she will have to pay on them, perhaps I had better telegraph her to come with only a dress suit case." They did not telegraph Kitty. About a week later Kitty arrived, and the next day Billy came, and to each the Fenelbys explained the Fenelby tariff on the way up from the station. Both thought it was a splendid idea, and agreed to uphold the tariff law and abide by it, and be governed by it. And when Mrs. Fenelby handed Kitty's baggage checks to Tom and asked him to see that the 3 trunks were sent over from the city and delivered at the house, Mr. Fenelby had no idea what was in store for him. End of Chapter 2. Recording by Arnold Banner, Thurmond, North Carolina. Chapter 3 of The Cheerful Smugglers by Ellis Parker Butler. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3 Kitty's Trunks. When Mr. Fenelby went to the city in the morning, he gave Kitty's trunk checks to the expressman. When he returned to his home in the evening, he found Kitty and Mrs. Fenelby on the porch, and Mrs. Fenelby was explaining to her visitor, for about the 10th time, the workings of the Fenelby domestic tariff. She had explained to Kitty how the tariff had come to be adopted, how it was to supply an education fund for Bobberts, who was at that moment asleep in his crib upstairs, and how every necessity brought into the house had to pay into Bobberts' bank 10%, and every luxury 30%. Kitty was a dear, as was Mrs. Fenelby, but they were as different as cousins could well be, for while Mrs. Fenelby was the man's ideal of a gentle domestic person, Kitty was the man's ideal of a forceful, jolly girl, and as full of liveliness as a well-behaved young lady could be. She was properly interested in Bobberts, and admired him loudly, but in her heart she was not sorry that Mr. Fenelby's cousin Will was to be a visitor at the house during her stay. She did not show any unmaidenly curiosity in regard to brother Will, but between doses of Bobberts and tariff she managed to learn about all Mrs. Fenelby knew regarding brother Will's past, present, and future, including a pretty minute description of his appearance, habits, and beliefs. Brother Will had arrived that very day, and on the way up from the station the Fenelbys had explained to him all about the domestic tariff, and also that until a bed could be sent out from the city he would have to find a bed wherever he could. And so it happened that he went right back to the city with Mr. Fenelby, and had not met Kitty, as he preferred to sleep in the city rather than in the hammock on the porch. There is an admirable natural honesty in women that prevents them from claiming that their husbands are perfection. In some this is so abnormally developed that, to be on the safe side, I suppose they will not allow that their husbands have any virtues whatsoever. In others the trace of this type of honesty is so slight that they will claim to every one, except their dearest friends, that their husbands are the best in the world. The normal wife first announces that her husband is as near perfect as any man can be, and then proceeds to enumerate all his imperfections, bad humors, and annoying habits, under the impression, perhaps, that she is praising him. Mrs. Fenelby had been proceeding in somewhat this way in her conversation with Kitty, under the impression that she was showing Kitty how lovely and domestically perfect was her life. But Kitty gained from it only the impression that Mrs. Fenelby had become the slave of Mr. Fenelby and Bobberts. The more Mrs. Fenelby explained the workings of the domestic tariff, the more positive of this did Kitty become. It was Laura who paid all the household bills, and so Laura had to pay the tariff duty on whatever came into the house. It was Laura who had to give up her weekly box of candy, because if she received it, she had to pay 24 cents duty. To Kitty, the Fenelby domestic tariff seemed to be a scheme concocted by Mr. Fenelby to make Laura provide an education fund for Bobberts. Poor Laura was evidently being misused, and did not know it. Poor Laura must be rescued, and given that womanly freedom that women are supposed to long for, even when they don't want it. Poor meek Laura needed some one to put a foot down, and Kitty felt that she had an admirable foot for that, or any other purpose. She proposed to put it down. When Mr. Fenelby entered his yard on his return from the city, he stopped short, and then looked up to where the two young women were sitting on the porch. "Hello," he said. "What is the matter with these trunks? Wouldn't that expressman carry them upstairs? I declare, those fellows are getting too independent for comfort. Unless you hold $1 tip out before them, they won't so much as turn around. Now, I distinctly told this fellow to carry these 3 trunks upstairs, and I said I would make it all right with him, and here he leaves them on the lawn. I hope, dear, you were at home when he came?" "Yes, dear," said Mrs. Fenelby, "I was, and you should not blame the poor man. I'm sure he tried hard enough to carry them up. He actually insisted on carrying them up whether we wanted them up or not. He was quite rude about it. He said you had told him to carry them up, and that he meant to do it whether we let him or not, and at last I had to give him $1 to leave them down here." "You gave him $1 not to carry these trunks upstairs?" exclaimed Mr. Fenelby. "Did you say you paid the man $1 not to carry them upstairs?" "I had to," said Mrs. Fenelby. "It was the only way I could prevent him from doing it. He said you told him to carry them up, and that up they must go, if he had to break down the front door to do it. I think he must have been drinking, Tom, he used such awful language, and at last he got quite maudlin about it, and sat down on one of the trunks and cried, actually cried. He said that for years and years he had refused to carry trunks upstairs, and that now, just when he had joined the Salvation Army and was trying to lead a better life and be kind and helpful and earn an extra $1 for his family by carrying trunks upstairs when gentlemen asked him to, I had to step in and refuse to let him carry trunks upstairs, and that this was the sort of thing that discouraged a poor man who was trying to make up for his past errors. So I gave him $1 to leave them down here." Mr. Fenelby looked at the 3 big trunks ruefully, and shook his head at them. "Well," he said, "I suppose it is all right, Laura, but I can't see why you wouldn't let him take them up. You know I don't enjoy that kind of work, and that I don't think it is good for me." "Kitty didn't want them taken up," said Mrs. Fenelby gently. "She wanted them left down here." "Down here?" asked Mr. Fenelby, as if dazed. "Down here on the grass?" "Yes," said Kitty lightly. "It was all my idea. Laura had nothing to do with it at all. I thought it would be nice to have the trunks down here on the lawn. Everywhere I visit they always take my trunks up to my room, and it gets so tiresome always having the same thing happen. So I thought that this time I would have a variety and leave my trunks on the lawn. I never in my life left my trunks on a front lawn, and I wanted to see how it would be. You don't think they will hurt the grass, do you, Mr. Fenelby?" Kitty asked this with such an air of sincerity that Mr. Fenelby seated himself on one of the trunks and looked up at her anxiously. He could not recall that he had ever heard of any weakness of mind in Kitty or in her family, but he could not doubt his ears. But, he said, "but you don't mean to leave them here, do you?" Kitty smiled down at him reassuringly. "Of course, if it is going to harm the grass at all, Mr. Fenelby, I shan't think of it," she said. "I know that sometimes when a board or anything lies on the grass a long time, the grass under the board gets all white, and if the trunks are going to make white spots on your lawn, I'll have them removed. But I thought that if we moved the trunks around to different places every day, it would avoid that. But you know more about that than I do. Do you think they will make white places on the lawn, Mr. Fenelby?" "I don't know," he said abstractedly. "I mean, yes, of course they will. But they will get rained on. You don't want your trunks rained on, you know. Trunks aren't meant to be rained on. It isn't good for them." A thought came to him suddenly. "You and Laura haven't quarreled, have you?" he asked, for he thought that perhaps that was why Kitty would not have her trunks carried up. "Indeed not!" cried Kitty, putting her arm affectionately around Laura's waist. I thought perhaps you had," faltered Mr. Fenelby. "I thought, that is to say, I was afraid, perhaps you were going away again. I thought you were going to make us a good long visit." "Indeed I am," said Kitty cheerfully. I am going to stay weeks and weeks and weeks. I am going to stay until you are all tired to death of me, and beg me to be gone." "That is good," said Mr. Fenelby, with an attempt at pleasure. "But don't you think, since you are going to do what we want you to do, and stay for weeks and weeks and weeks, that you had better let your trunks be taken up to your room? Or, I'll tell you what we'll do. Suppose we just take the trunks into the lower hall." He felt pretty certain now that Kitty must have had a little touch of, say, sunstroke, or something of that kind, and he went on in a gentle, argumentative tone. "Just into the lower hall," he said. "That would be different from having them in your room, and it would save my grass. I worked hard to get this lawn looking as it does now, Kitty, and I cannot deny that big trunks like these will not do it any good. Let us say we will put the trunks in the lower hall. Then they will be safe, too. No one can steal them there. A front lawn is a rather conspicuous place for trunks. And what will the neighbors say, too, if we leave the trunks on the lawn? Why shouldn't we put the trunks in the lower hall?" "Well," said Kitty, "I can't afford it, that is why. Really, Mr. Fenelby, I can't afford to have those 3 trunks brought into the house." "And yet," said Mr. Fenelby, with just the slightest hint of impatience, "you girls could afford to give the man $1 not to take them in. That is woman's logic." "Oh, $1!" said Kitty. "If it was only a matter of $1! I hope you don't think, Mr. Fenelby, that I travel with only $10 worth of baggage. No, indeed. I simply cannot afford to pay 10% duty on what is in those trunks, and so I prefer to let them remain on the lawn. I wrote Laura that I expected to be treated as one of the family while I was visiting her, and if the domestic tariff is part of the way the family is treated, I certainly expect to live up to it. Now, don't blame Laura, for she was not only willing to have the trunks come in without paying duty, but insisted that they should." Mr. Fenelby looked very grave. He was in a perplexing situation. He certainly did not wish to appear inhospitable, and yet Laura had had no right to say that the trunks could enter the house duty free. The only way such an unusual alteration in the domestic tariff could be made was by an act of the family Congress, and he very well knew that if once the matter of revising the tariff was taken up, it was beyond the ken of man where it would end. He preferred to stand pat on the tariff as it had been originally adopted. "I told her," said Kitty, "that she had no right to throw off the duty on my trunks at all, and that I wouldn't have it, and I didn't." "Well, Tom," said Mrs. Fenelby, "you know perfectly well that we can't leave those trunks out on the lawn. It would not only be absolutely foolish to do that, but cruel to Kitty. A girl simply can't visit away from home without trunks, and it is absolutely necessary that Kitty should have her trunks. 'Necessities 10%,'" quoted Kitty. "But, my dear," said Mr. Fenelby softly, "we really can't break all our household rules just because Kitty has brought 3 trunks, can we? Kitty does not expect us to do that, and I think she looks at it in a very rational manner. I like the spirit she has evinced." "Very well, then," said Mrs. Fenelby. "You must find some way to take care of those trunks, for we cannot leave them on the lawn." "Why can't we take them to some neighbor's house?" asked Kitty. "I am sure some neighbor will be glad to store them for me for a while. Aren't you on good terms with your neighbors, Laura?" "The Rankins might take them," said Laura thoughtfully. "They have that vacant room, you know, Tom. They might not mind letting us put them in there." "I don't know the Rankins," said Kitty, "but I am sure they are perfectly lovely people, and that they would not mind in the least." "I know they wouldn't," said Mr. Fenelby. Rankin would be glad to do something of that sort to repay me for the number of times he has borrowed my lawn mower. I will step over after dinner and ask him." "Are you sure, very sure, that you do not mind, Kitty?" asked Mrs. Fenelby. "You will not feel hurt or anything?" "Oh, no," said Kitty lightly. "It will be a lark. I never in my life went visiting with 3 trunks and then had them stored in another house. It will be quite like being shipwrecked on a desert island, to get along with 1 shirtwaist and 1 handkerchief." "It will not be quite that bad, you know," said Mr. Fenelby, with the air of a man stating a great discovery, "because, don't you see, you can open your trunks at the Rankins' and bring over just as many things as you think you can afford to pay on." For some reason that Mr. Fenelby could not fathom, Kitty laughed merrily at this, and then they all went in to dinner. It was a very good dinner, of the kind that Bridget could prepare when she was in the humor, and they sat rather longer over it than usual, and then Mr. Fenelby proposed that he should step over to the Rankins' and arrange about the storage of Kitty's trunks, and on thinking it over, he decided that he had better step down to the station and see if he could not get a man to carry the trunks across the street and up the Rankins' stairs. As they filed out of the house upon the porch, Kitty suddenly decided that it was a beautiful evening for a little walk, and that nothing would please her so much as to walk to the station with Mr. Fenelby, if Laura would be one of the party, and after running up to see that Bobberts was all right, Laura said that she would go, and they started. As they were crossing the street to the Rankins', Kitty suddenly turned back. "You 2 go ahead," she said. "The air will do you good, Laura. I have something I want to do," and she ran back. She entered the house and looked out of the window until she saw the Fenelbys go into the Rankins' and come out again, and saw them start to the station. But as soon as they were out of sight she dashed down the porch steps and threw open the lids of her trunks. Never in the history of trunks was the act of unpacking done so quickly or so recklessly. She dived into the masses of fluffiness and emerged with great armfuls, and hurried them into the house, up the stairs and into her closet, and was down again for another load. If she had been looting the trunks she could not have worked more hurriedly or more energetically, and when the last armful had been carried up, she slammed the lids and turned the keys and sank in a graceful position on the lower porch step. Mr. and Mrs. Fenelby returned with leisurely slowness of pace, the station loafer and man of little work slouching along at a respectful distance behind them. Kitty greeted them with a cheerful frankness of face. The man of little work looked at the 3 big trunks as if their size was in some way a personal insult to him. He tried to assume the look of a man who had been cozened away from his needed rest on false pretenses. "I didn't know as the trunks was as big as them," he drawled. "If I'd knowed they was, I wouldn't have walked all the way over here. 50 cents ain't no fair price for carrying 3 trunks, the size and heft of them, across, well, say this is a 60-foot street, say 80 feet, and up a flight of stairs. I don't say nothin', but I'll leave it to the ladies." 50 cents? cried Kitty. "I should think not. Why, I didn't imagine you would do it for less than $1. I mean to pay you $1. "That's right," said the man. "You see, I have to walk all the way back to the station when I get through, too. My time going and coming is worth something." He bent down and took the largest trunk by one handle to heave it to his back, and as he touched the handle the trunk almost arose into the air of its own accord. The man straightened up and looked at it, and a strange look passed across his face, but he closed his mouth and said nothing. "Would you like a lift?" asked Mr. Fenelby. "No," said the man shortly.
I know how to handle trunks, I do."
And it certainly seemed that he did, for he swung it to his back with all the grace of a Sandow, and started off with it. Mr. Fenelby looked at him with surprise. "Now, isn't that one of the oddities of nature?" said Mr. Fenelby. "That fellow looks as if he had no strength at all, and see how he carries off that trunk as if there was not a thing in it. I suppose it is the knack he has. Now, see how hard it is for me merely to lift one end of this smallest one." But before he could touch it, Kitty had grasped him by the arm. "Oh, don't try it!" she cried. "Please don't. You might hurt your back." End of Chapter 3. Recording by Arnold Banner, Thurmond, North Carolina. Chapter 4 of The Cheerful Smugglers by Ellis Parker Butler. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4. Billy. A few minutes before noon the next day, Billy Fenelby dropped into Mr. Fenelby's office in the city, and the two men went out to lunch together. It would be hard to imagine two brothers more unlike than Thomas and William Fenelby. For if Thomas Fenelby was inclined to be small in stature and precise in his manner, William was all that his nickname of Billy implied, and was not so many years out of his college football 11, where he had won a place because of his size and strength. Billy Fenelby, after having been heroized by innumerable girls during his college years, had become definitely a man's man, and was in the habit of saying that his girly girl days were over, and that he would walk around the block any day to escape meeting a girl. He was not afraid of girls, and he did not hate them, but he simply held that they were not worth while. The truth was that he had been so petted and worshipped by them as a star football player that the attention they paid him as an ordinary young man, not unlike many other young men out of college, seemed tame by comparison. No doubt he had come to believe, during his college days, that the only interesting thing a girl could do was to admire a man heartily, and in the manner that only football players and matinee idols are admired. So that now, when he had no particular claim to admiration, girls had become, so far as he was concerned, useless affairs. "Now about this girl person that you have over at your house," he said to his brother, when they were seated at their lunch. "What about her?" "About her?" asked Mr. Fenelby. "How do you mean?" "What about her?" repeated Billy. "You know how I feel about the girl business. I suppose she is going to stay a while?" "Kitty? I think so. We want her to. But you needn't bother about Kitty. She won't bother you a bit. She's the right sort, Billy. Not like Laura, of course, for I don't believe there is another woman anywhere just like Laura. But Kitty is not the ordinary flighty girl. You should hear her appreciate Bobberts. She saw his good points and remarked about them at once, and the way she has caught the spirit of the domestic tariff that I was telling you about is fine. Most girls would have hemmed and hawed about it, but she didn't. No, sir. She just saw what a fine idea it was, and when she saw that she couldn't afford to have her 3 trunks brought into the house, she proposed that she leave them at a neighbor's. Did not make a single complaint. Don't worry about Kitty." "That is all right about the tariff," said Billy. "I can't say I think much of that tariff idea myself, but so long as it is the family custom, a guest couldn't do any less than live up to it. But I don't like the idea of having to spend a number of weeks in the same house with any girl. They are all bores, Tom, and I know it. A man can't have any comfort when there is a girl in the house, and between you and me, that Kitty girl looks like the kind that is sure to be always right at a fellow's side." I was wondering if Laura would think it was all right if I stayed in town here." "No, she wouldn't," said Tom shortly. "She would be offended, and so would I. If you are going to let some nonsense about girls being a bore, which is all foolishness, keep you away from the house, you had better Why," he added, "it is an insult to us, to Laura and me, just as if you had said right out that the company we choose to ask to our home was not good enough for you to associate with. If you think our house is going to bore you—" "Now look here, old man," said Billy, "I don't mean that at all, and you know I don't. I simply don't like girls, and that is all there is to it. But I'll come. I'll have my trunk sent over, and say, do I have to pay duty on what I have in my trunk?" "Certainly," said Mr. Fenelby. "That is, of course, if you want to enter into the spirit of the thing. It is only 10%, you know, and it all goes into Bobberts' education fund." Billy sat in thought a while. "I wonder," he said at length, "how it would do if I just put a few things into my suit case, enough to last me a few days at a time, and left my trunk over here. I don't need everything I brought in that trunk. I was perfectly reckless about putting things in that trunk. I put into that trunk nearly everything I own in this world, just because the trunk was so big that it would hold everything. And it seemed a pity to bring a big trunk like that with nothing in it but air. Now I could take my suit case and put into it the things I will really need." "Certainly," said Mr. Fenelby. "You can do that if you want to, and it would be perfectly fair to Bobberts. All Bobberts asks is to be paid a duty on what enters the house. He don't say what shall be brought in, or what shall not. Personally, Billy, I would call the duty off so far as you are concerned, but I don't think Laura would like it. We started this thing fair, and we are all living up to it. Laura made Kitty live up to it, and you can see it would not be right for me to make an exception in your case just because you happen to be my brother." "No," agreed Billy, "it wouldn't. I don't ask it. I will play the game, and I will play it fair. All I ask is, if I bring a suit case, do I have to pay on the case? Because if I do, I won't bring it. I can wrap up all I need in a piece of paper and save the duty on the suit case. I believe in playing fair, Tom, but that is no reason why I should be extravagant." "I think," said Tom doubtfully, "suit cases should come in free. Of course, if it was a brand new suit case it would have to pay duty, but an old one, one that has been used, is different. It is like wrapping paper. The duty is assessed on what the package contains and not on the package itself. If it is not a new suit case, you will not have to pay duty on it." "Then my suit case will go in free," said Billy. "It is one of the first crop of suit cases that was raised in this country, and I value it more as a relic than as a suit case. I carry it more as a souvenir than as a suit case." "Souvenirs are different," said Mr. Fenelby. "Souvenirs are classed as luxuries and pay 30%. If you consider it a souvenir, it pays duty." "I will consider it a suit case," said Billy promptly. "I will consider it a poor, old, worn out suit case." "I think that would be better," agreed Mr. Fenelby. "But we will have to wait and see what Laura considers it." As on the previous evening, the ladies were on the porch enjoying the evening air when Mr. Fenelby reached home with Billy in tow, and Billy greeted them as if he had never wished anything better than to meet Miss Kitty. "Where is this custom house Tom has been telling me about?" he asked, as soon as the handshaking was over. "I want to have my baggage examined. I have dutiable goods to declare. Who is the inspector?" "Laura is," said Kitty. "She is the slave of the grinding system that fosters monopoly and treads under heel the poor people." "All right," said Billy. "I declare one collar.
I wish to bring one collar into the bosom of this family. I have in this suitcase one collar. I never travel without one extra collar. It is the 2 for a quarter kind, with a name like a sleeping car, and it has been laundered twice, which brings it to the verge of ruin. How much do I have to pay on the one collar?"
"Collars are a necessity," said Mrs. Fenelby, "and they pay 10%. "What a notion!" exclaimed Kitty. "Collars are not a necessity. Collars are an actual luxury, especially in warm weather. Many very worthy men never wear a collar at all, and would not think of wearing one in hot weather. They are like jewelry, or something of that sort. Collars certainly pay 30%.
"I reserve the right to appeal," said Billy. "Those are the words of an unjust judge. But how much do I take off the value of the collar because 2/3 of its life has been laundered away? How much is 1/3 of 12½?"
"Now that is pure nonsense," Kitty said, "and I shan't let poor dear little Bobberts be robbed in any such way. That collar cost 12½ cents, and it has had 2½ cents spent on it twice. So it is now a 17½-cent collar, and 30% of that is
"Oh, if you are going to rob me!" exclaimed Billy. "I don't care. I can get along without a collar. I will bring out a sweater to morrow."
"Sweaters pay only 10%, said Kitty sweetly. "What else have you in your suit case?"
"Air," said Billy. "Nothing but air. I didn't think I could afford to bring anything else, and I will leave the collar out here. I open the case, I take out the collar, I place it gently on the porch railing, and I take the empty suit case into the house. I pay no duty at all, and that is what you get for being so grasping."
Mr. Fenelby shook his head. "You can't do that, Billy," he said. "That puts the suit case in another class. It isn't a package for holding anything now, and it isn't a necessity, because you can't need an empty suit case. So it doesn't go in at 10%, so it must be a luxury, and it pays 30%. "That suit case," said Billy, looking at it with a calculating eye, "is not worth 30% of what it is worth. It is worthless, and I wouldn't give 10% of nothing for it. It stays outside, so I pay nothing. I go in free, unless I have to pay on myself." "You don't have to," said Kitty, "although I suppose Laura and Tom think you are a luxury."
"Don't you think I am one?" asked Billy.
"No, I don't," said Kitty frankly. "And when you know me better, you will not ask such a foolish question. Wherever I am, there a young man is a necessity." End of Chapter 4. Recording by Arnold Banner, Thurmond, North Carolina. Chapter 5 of The Cheerful Smugglers by Ellis Parker Butler. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5 The Pink Shirtwaist. The morning after Billy Fenelby's arrival at the Fenelby home, he awakened unusually early, as one is apt to awaken in a strange bed, and he lay a while thinking over the events of the previous evening. He was more than ever convinced that Kitty was not the kind of girl he liked. He felt that she had made a barefaced effort to flirt with him the evening before, and that she was just the kind of a girl that was apt to be troublesome to a bachelor. She was the kind of a girl that would demand a great deal of attention, and expect it as a natural right, and then, when she received it, make the man feel that he had been attentive in quite another way, and that the only fair thing would be to propose. And he felt that she was the kind of girl that no man could propose to with any confidence whatever. She would be just as likely to accept him as not, and having accepted him,
she would be just as likely to expect him to marry her as not. He felt that he was in a very ticklish situation. He saw that Kitty was the sort of a girl that would take any air of rude indifference he might assume to be a challenge, and any comely polite attention to be serious love making. He saw that the only safe thing for him to do would be to run away, but since he had seen Kitty, that was the last thing in the world that he would have thought of doing. He decided that he would constitute her bright eyes and red lips to be a mental warning sign reading "Danger" in large letters, and that whenever he saw them he would be as wary as a rabbit, and yet as brave as a lion. He next felt a sincere regret that he had refused to pay the duty on the clean collar he had brought with him, and that he had left on the railing of the porch. He got out of bed and looked at the collar he had worn the day before, and frowned at it, as he saw that it was not quite immaculate. Then he listened closely for any sound in the house that would tell him Mr. or Mrs. Fenelby were up. He heard nothing. He hastily slipped on his clothes, and tiptoed out of the room and down the stairs. This tariff for revenue only was well enough for Thomas and Laura, and assessing a duty of 10% on everything that came into the house, and 30% on luxuries, might fill up Bobberts' bank and provide that baby with an education fund, but it was an injustice to bachelor uncles when there was an unmarried girl in the house. If this Kitty girl was willing to so forget what was due to a young man as to appear in one dress the whole time of her stay, that was her lookout. But for his part he did not intend to lower his dignity by going down to breakfast in a soiled collar. If creeping down to the porch in his stockings and bringing in that collar surreptitiously was smuggling, then Billy stopped short at the screen door. From there he could see the spot on the railing where he had put the collar, and the collar was not there. No doubt it had fallen to the lawn. He opened the screen door carefully and stepped outside. The early morning air was cool and sweet, and an ineffable quiet rested on the suburb. He tiptoed gently across the porch and down the porch steps, and hobbled carefully across the painful pebble walk, and stepped upon the lawn. There was dew on the lawn. The lawn was soaked and saturated and steeped in dew. It bathed his feet in chilliness, as if he had stepped into a pail of ice water, and the vines that clambered up the porch side were dewy too. As he kneeled on the grass and pawed among the vines, seeking the missing collar, the vines showered down the crystal drops upon him and soaked his sleeves, and added a finishing touch of ruin to the collar he was wearing. The other collar was not there. It was not among the vines, it was not on the lawn, it was not on the porch, and, soaked in socks and sleeves, he retreated. He paused a minute on the porch to glance thoughtfully at the moist footprints his feet left on the boards, and wondered if they would be dry before Tom or Laura came down. At any rate, there was no help for it now, and he went up the stairs again. The most uncomfortable small discomfort is wet socks, whether they come from a small hole in the bottom of a shoe or from walking on a lawn in the early morning, and Billy wiggled his toes as he slowly and carefully climbed the stairs. As he turned the last turn at the top, he stopped short and blushed. Kitty was standing there awaiting him, a smile on her face, and his other collar in her hand. She laid her finger on her lip and tapped it there to command silence, and raised her brows at him to let him know that she knew where he had been and why. "I thought you would want it," she said in the faintest whisper, "so I smuggled it in last night. I had no idea you would stoop to such a thing, but I felt so sorry for you without a collar. "Thanks," whispered Billy. It was a masterpiece of whispering, that word. It was a gruff whisper, warding off familiarity, and yet it was a grateful whisper, as a whisper should be, to thank a pretty girl for a favor done. But still it was a scoffing whisper with a tinge of resentfulness, but resentfulness tempered by courtesy. Underlying all this was a flavor of independence, but not such crude independence that it killed the delicate tone that implied that the hearer of the whisperer was a very pretty girl, and that fact was granted even while her interference in the whisperer's affairs was misliked, and her suspicions of dishonest acts on his part considered uncalled for. If he did not quite succeed in getting all this crowded into the one word, it was doubtless because his feet were so wet and uncomfortable. Billy was rather conscious that he had not quite succeeded, and he would have tried again, adding this time an inflection to mean that he well understood that her object was to get him into a quasi-conspiracy, and thus draw him irrevocably into confidential relations of a misdemeanor from which he could not escape, but that he refused to be so drawn. I say he would have repeated the word, but a sound in one of the bedrooms close at hand sent them both tiptoeing to their rooms. They had hardly reached safety when the door of Mr. Fenelby's room opened, and Mr. Fenelby stole out quietly. Stole as quietly down the stairs and out onto the porch. He looked at the railing where Billy had left the collar, and then he peered over the railing and as silently stole up the stairs again. He paused at Billy's door and tapped on it. Billy opened it a mere hint of a crack. "What is it?" he whispered. "That collar," whispered Mr. Fenelby. "I thought about it all night, and I didn't think it right that you should be made to do without it. I just went down to get it, but it isn't there." "Never mind," whispered Billy. "Don't worry, old man. I will wear the one I have." Mr. Fenelby hesitated. "Of course," he whispered, "you won't, that is to say, you needn't tell Laura I went down." "Certainly not," whispered Billy. "It was awfully kind of you to think of it, but I'll make this one do." Mr. Fenelby waited at the door a moment longer, as if he had something more to say, but Billy had closed the door, and he went back to his room. It was with relief that Bridget heard the door close behind Mr. Fenelby. She had been standing on the little landing of the back stairs where he had almost caught her as she was coming up. If she had been one step higher he would have seen her head. Usually she would not have minded this, for she had a perfect right to be on the back stairs in the early morning, but this time she felt that it was her duty to remain undiscovered. Now that Mr. Fenelby was gone, she softly stepped to Billy's door and knocked lightly. "Mr. Billy, sir, are you there?" she whispered. Billy opened the door a crack and looked out. "Morning to you," she said, in a hoarse whisper. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but Mrs. Fenelby asked me to bring up the collar you left on the porch railin', and to let no one know I'd done it, and I just wanted to let you know the reason I have not brung it up is because belike somebody else has brang it up already, for it is gone." "Thank you, Bridget," whispered Billy. "It doesn't matter." She turned away, but when he had closed the door she paused, and after hesitating a moment she tapped on his door again. He opened it. "I have put me foot in it," she said, "like I always do. Would you be so good as to forget I mentioned the name of Mrs. Fenelby? That's a dear man. I remember now I was not to mention it to you." "Certainly, Bridget," said Billy, and he closed the door and went again to the window, where he was turning his socks over and over in the streak of sunlight that warmed a part of the window sill. It took the socks a little longer to dry than he had thought it would, and they were still damp enough to make his feet feel anything but comfortable when he heard the breakfast bell tinkle faintly. He hurried the rest of his toilet and went down the stairs, assuming as he went the air of unsuspected innocence that is the inborn right of every man who knows he has done wrong. The bodily Billy was more conscious of the discomfort of his feet, but the mental Billy was all collar. He had never known a collar to be so obtrusive. He felt that he must seem all collar, even to the most casual eye. But he was upheld by the belief that no one would dare to mention collar to him in public. If he had sinned, he was not the only sinner, for he was but a partner in conspiracy. He walked down the stairs boldly. "And to think that his vanity should be the cause of robbing poor little Bobberts," he heard a clear voice say as he neared the dining room door. "It is too mean. I can never look up to man with the faith I have always had in man after this. But I know they were his footprints, Laura." "Are you so sure, Kitty?" asked Mrs. Fenelby. Mightn't they be Bridget's?" "They were not," said the voice of Kitty, and Billy paused where he was and stood still. "Bridget does not go about in the wet grass in her stocking feet. Those were Billy's tracks on the porch. I am no Sherlock Holmes, but I can tell you just what he did. He stole down before we were awake to look for that collar, and he did not find it on the railing where he had left it. Then he saw where it had fallen, and he went down on the wet lawn and got it. Watch him when he comes in to breakfast. He will be wearing a collar, and it will not be the one he wore last night." Billy turned and tiptoed softly up the stairs again, undoing his tie as he went. When he came down his neck was neatly but informally swathed in a white handkerchief. 3 pairs of eyes watched him as he entered, but he faced them unflinchingly. Mr. and Mrs. Fenelby let their eyes drop before his glance, but Kitty met his gaze with a challenge. There was nothing of treachery in her face, and yet she had sought to betray him. He looked at her with greater interest than he had ever known himself to feel regarding any girl, and as he looked he had a startled sense that she was fairer than she had been, and he caught his breath quickly and began to talk to Mrs. Fenelby. "Tom," he said after breakfast, as Mr. Fenelby was getting ready to leave to catch his train, "I think I'll walk over to the station with you. I have something I want to say to you." "Come along," said Mr. Fenelby, "but you will have to walk quickly. I have just time to catch my train." "Did you notice anything peculiar about Miss Kitty this morning?" asked Billy, when they had left the house. "Peculiar?" said Mr. Fenelby. "No, I don't think so." "Well, I don't want to make trouble, Tom," said Billy, "but I think I ought to speak about this thing. If it wasn't serious, I wouldn't mention it at all, but I think you ought to know what is going on in your own house. I think you ought to know what kind of a girl Miss Kitty is, so that you can be on your guard. Now, you went down to get that collar for me, didn't you?" "I wish you wouldn't mention that," said Mr. Fenelby, with some annoyance. "Oh, I know all about that," said Billy warmly. "You say that because you don't like to be thanked for all these nice, thoughtful things you do for a fellow. But I do thank you, just as much as if you had found the collar and had brought it up to me. That was all right. You would have paid the duty on it, and that would have been all right. But what do you think Miss Kitty did? Why do you think you could not find that collar? Do you know what she did? She brought that collar into the house, smuggled it in, and she had the nerve, the actual nerve, to give it to me. And I took it. I couldn't do anything else, could I? When a girl offered it to me, I couldn't say I wouldn't take it, could I? I had to be a gentleman about it. And then she tried to get me into trouble by telling you I would come down to breakfast wearing that collar. She tried to make out that I was a smuggler." "I suppose it was just a bit of fun," said Mr. Fenelby. "Girls are that way, some of them." "Well, I want it understood that that collar is in the house, and that I didn't bring it in," said Billy, "and that if this domestic tariff business is to be carried out fairly, it is Miss Kitty's business to pay the duty on it. I want to set myself right with you. But the thing I wanted to speak about was far more serious. Do you know what she had on this morning?" "What she had on?" asked Mr. Fenelby. "What did she have on?" "She had on a pink shirt waist," said Billy, fiercely. "That is what she had on. Right at breakfast there, in plain sight of everyone. A pink shirt waist." "Well, that's all right, isn't it?" asked Mr. Fenelby, doubtfully. "It's proper to wear a pink shirt waist at breakfast, isn't it? I think Laura wears shirt waists at breakfast sometimes. I'm sure it's all right, an informal home breakfast like that." "But it was pink," insisted Billy. "I looked right at it, and I know. Real pink. You wouldn't notice it because you are so honest yourself, and so confiding. But I noticed it the first thing. Now what do you think of your Miss Kitty? What do you say to that? A girl coming right down to breakfast in a pink shirt waist, right before the whole family?" I don't know what to say," faltered Mr. Fenelby. And this was the truth, for he did not. "Well, what would you say if I told you that she had on a white shirt waist last evening, a white one with fluffy stuff all round the collar?" asked Billy. "Wouldn't you say that that proved it?" "I don't see anything wrong in that," said Mr. Fenelby. "What does it prove?" "It proves that she has two shirt waists," said Billy, seriously. "That is what it proves. Two shirt waists, a white one and a pink one for dinner and one for breakfast. I don't blame you for not noticing it, but I am strong that way. I notice colors and trimmings and all that sort of thing, and I tell you she has two. I saw them both, and I know it. If that isn't serious, I don't know what is." "Well?" said Mr. Fenelby. "Well?" echoed Billy. "She is only supposed to have one. She only paid duty on one, and she has two. That is what I call real smuggling. And nobody knows how many more she has. Dozens, for all I know. Imagine her talking about my one poor old last year's collar, and then flaunting around in two shirt waists right before our eyes. I call that pretty serious. I'm going to watch her. You can't be here all day to do it, but I haven't anything else to do, and I'm going to stay right around her all day and find out about this thing." "If you don't want to," began Mr. Fenelby, remembering Billy's protestations of dislike for girls. "I'll do my duty by you and Bobberts, old man," said Billy, generously. "I was only going to say that Laura could look out for that sort of thing," said Mr. Fenelby. "I might say a word to her." "Well, now, I didn't like to bring that part of it up," said Billy, "but since you mention it, I guess I had better say the whole thing. It isn't natural that a woman shouldn't notice what another woman has on, is it? They are all keen on that sort of thing. I don't say Laura is standing in with Kitty on this shirt waist smuggling. I suppose it worries her terribly to see Kitty smuggling clothes in right under her nose. But how can Laura say anything about it? Kitty is her guest, isn't she? You leave it to me." Just then they reached the station, and the train arrived, and Mr. Fenelby jumped aboard, and as it pulled out, Billy turned and walked back to the house. Chapter 6. Arnold Banner, Thurman, North Carolina.